Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, How to Stay Human-Centric in the AI Revolution. My name is Jason Partridge, and I'm the VP of Client Experience at Lux Research and a co-founder at Lux Motive Base. I'm going to be moderating today's session. Presenting today is my colleague, Ujwal Arkel-Good. He's the EVP and Group Director here at Lux Research. So throughout this webinar, you can type any questions you have in the question box on your screen, and time permitting, we're going to answer all the questions we can get to. But don't worry, if your question does not get answered, please don't hesitate to drop us an email. You can send your questions to questions@luxresearchinc.com. That's questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will respond. So at this point, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Ujwal Arkel-Good, and let's get started.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jason. Hi, everybody. Human-centricity, what an important topic, especially as the AI revolution is upon us. I think, we as researchers, as innovators, have sort of a moment of crisis at the current point in time, because with the AI revolution and the amount of attention AI is getting, it's very easy for us to forget about one of the most important tenets of research, which is human centricity. Ultimately, without human centricity, we cannot do what we want to do so effectively: launch new products, resolve new solutions or renovations for existing product lines, improve our campaigns and go-to-market strategies. All the things we want to do as organizations ultimately fundamentally require human centricity. And in this current moment in time, this is a topic that isn't being talked about quite enough. And it's one of the reasons why we're doing this webinar, because we believe that, especially as AI tools and techniques and methodologies seep into our research practices, it is absolutely critical for us to ensure that they're used in the right way so as to enable, not disable, enable human centricity. So we're going to begin by just setting the foundation. What is human centricity, or what makes something human centric? There are a lot of definitions around it. Fundamentally, or if you ask ChatGPT as an example, it will tell you that it's about putting the human being at the heart of whatever you're doing, ultimately with the goal of empathizing, building empathy for the human condition in a particular context or a setting. And there are, of course, many research methodologies that enable that. But of course, from our perspective, from an anthropological perspective, human centricity becomes all the more critical. And what we're going to talk about today is what anthropology has to offer to help us define human centricity more clearly for our organizations, and then to help apply that into the world of AI. And we're actually going to demonstrate the way we are applying human centricity through the lens of anthropology into AI. But before we do that, we have to define the problem, and we do have a fundamental problem. And the problem is the following. A lot of the generative AI tools that are in front of us are not built as research tools. They're built as tools that are generating new data based on an analysis of existing data. Fundamentally, at the most simplistic level, that is the purpose of generative AI. It is not a tool built for the purpose of human-centric research. And this is an important foundation for us to, or an important definition for us to begin with, because if we don't understand that and we use these generative AI tools incorrectly, we have the potential to create a monster, right? Imagine going to IKEA, coming home with, all the building blocks, and then chucking the instruction manual and trying to build whatever that IKEA piece of furniture is. The chance of building a Frankenmonster is very high, like that image on the right of your screen. And I think that's really the goal for us as we talk about human centricity, is to ensure that we use generative AI in the right way. And I want to be clear, by no means are we poo-pooing the evolution of AI tools. In fact, we are bullish on it when we believe it has some incredible things to offer the world of research and innovation. But everything is about putting it into the right context. So let's do that. Let's begin with a fundamental definition of human centricity, because this is a definition that is also often misaligned within organizations. I can't tell you the number of times I've had conversations with different folks within the same company who all have a slightly varying definition of human centricity. And so I thought what would be valuable is to bring forward the anthropological definition of human centricity. What is it? It's really about three it's a three-pronged approach from an anthropological standpoint. The first is context. Context is king, as we all like to say. It emphasizes the importance of understanding social dynamics. We talk a lot in anthropology about power dynamics, because in essence, power exists within literally any context. If the context is, buying groceries or buying cereal specifically, and you're in the grocery store in the cereal aisle, and you're picking up a cereal box, and you're surrounded by other people, let's say other parents who are also buying cereal boxes, there's that context establishes certain power dynamics. For example, if I'm picking the sugary cereal while the person next to me is picking the healthier cereal, it will innately create a level of pressure, social pressure in my mind. It will make me feel less than ideal, even though I know that healthy cereal box is not going to be eaten in my household. That's an example of the innate implicit pressure power dynamics that we all experience as human beings, as consumers. The second is interpretation. Language fundamentally is a critical tool, not just for communication, but it's a critical tool because it helps establish and reinforce social structures. And this is what we do as anthropologists. We study the structure of language because it helps us understand these naturally existing social structures, helps us understand these naturally existing implicit meanings. And the third is reflexivity, which is really about acknowledging our own biases and trying to use, at least in our case, technology. And we'll talk a little bit about how AI can assist in this, but trying to use technology to remove the personal biases from the research process so that we can be as human-centric as innately possible. So if you take these three key requirements that anthropology imposes on us, and you use these three to define clearly what is human-centricity within your organizations, not only will you gain incredible clarity that comes from the world of the social sciences, but you'll also then be able to create clear requirements for the use of AI. Because turns out the biggest drawbacks of generative AI, at least as it sits today, are the strengths of anthropology. That's the power of human centricity. So it turns out the biggest drawbacks equal the strengths of anthropology. So why not then use the strengths of anthropology in order to make AI tools more useful, more human-centric? Because let's face it, without context, language is just a bunch of words. Without context, what generative AI will do for you is create a bunch of words, do a creative exercise for you. And it's very effective at that, but it's not doing a human-centric analysis for you. So let's take these three requirements for human centricity and let's bring it into the world of anthropology. For those of you who've attended earlier webinars of mine, the next two slides are going to be a bit of repetition, but bear with me, because for many of you who are new to our webinar series, I just want to illustrate what we mean by anthropology, because I'm sure you're thinking, okay, I get it, but I don't quite get it. So let's define that. What do we mean by the study of language? And how does anthropology help us understand context in language? On your screen, you're seeing a simplified illustration of the language use around the topic of gut health. The stuff you see in green on your screen is what we call the explicit associations, associations that people make explicitly, i.e., if you put people in a room and you ask them to define gut health, or you ask them questions about how they think about their own gut health, they will connect it to weight loss and immune function and how they eat and the gut-brain axis. So everything in green refers to the explicit relationships. But here's the interesting part about how human beings engage. We start a conversation about gut health. From there, it goes into immunity. From immunity, it goes into a discussion about chronic health conditions. From chronic health, we link it to toxins in our body. And from toxins, we link it to wellness. What anthropology teaches us is that it doesn't matter that wellness is 1, 2, 3, 4 hops away from the central node of gut health. What matters is wellness is being discussed within the same context as gut health, i.e., wellness now bears a relationship to gut health. The stuff you see in purple, in dark green, this is what we refer to as the implicit side of the meaning equation. They're associations of associations. So this is what anthropology does. It allows us to study the language that consumers use within any context but it allows us to study it naturally as it's happening on the internet. We don't have to stop people, ask them questions. We don't have to force them into a room. People are having conversations on their own volition, and they're making these linkages. It becomes our job then to apply technology and anthropology in order to study these implicit relationships. But there are two important concepts that I've just illustrated for you in this simplified framework, which is actually, I've given you a crash course on post-structuralist anthropology in the last two slides. But in essence, there are two concepts here. One is the concept of context, which is the number one requirement for human centricity. The second is the context, is within the context of gut health, studying language use and understanding the implicit side of language use so that we can not only decode power dynamics, but understand the structure of language, which is in essence teaching us about the social structure in the context of gut health. So those are two out of the three requirements. And I'll come to the third requirement, which is about reflexivity as we go along. But this is the fundamental contribution of anthropology, and it has an immense opportunity for us, especially in the context of AI. So let's make this more tangible. On your screen, you're looking at a real example of contextual language, okay? Contextual language that is in the context of gut health and in the subcontext of immunity or immune function, okay? So we're now looking at immunity in the context of gut, and we're looking at what people discuss naturally in this context, okay? On the next slide, I'm going to change the sub-context. We call it a microculture. I'm going to change it from immunity to brain health, okay? So I changed the axis slightly. I'm still in the macro context of gut health, but you'll notice the language has changed significantly. Talk about the associations of the associations, teaching us about how you change even the sub-context within a macro context and language changes. Let me give you a side-by-side comparison to show you the nuanced differences. On the top left, you've got immunity in the context of gut. Bottom right, brain in the context of gut. Look at the difference in language. This is what we anthropologists get excited about because it tells us about the natural implicit ways in which human beings give meaning to ideas. Why is this important? If we can understand how we naturally give meaning to ideas like brain health versus immune function, we can identify the implicit and not so well articulated opportunity spaces, which is in essence the holy grail for innovation. We want to identify naturally forming demand spaces that may not be fully mainstream yet, or that all our competitors may not be aware of yet, that we can identify, quantify, and predict the evolution of. So this is really the contribution of anthropology, right? In bringing human centricity, is it allows us to look at context, and within that context allows us to analyze language to decode meaning and decode demand. Okay, now, here's the interesting part. Anthropology gives us a very clear playing field, right? It gives us the outlines and tells us you must color within the lines, right? If I go outside the line, I'm breaking context. This is what anthropology teaches us. Turns out that's the most important thing that AI is missing right now. Generative AI is missing to do human-centric research, right? I'm not commenting on the broad purpose of AI. I'm commenting on purpose of AI for human-centric research. Turns out, if we can tell AI what to color within, if we can give it that diagram that I see my 5-year-old doing every single day, if we can confine it to the right context, turns out it can do amazing things. So let's talk about how that's possible. This is a simple visualization. If I ask AI a question about, I don't know, the gut-brain axis. Hey, help me understand how consumers think about the gut-brain axis. What generative AI will do is go and look at its large language model. It doesn't know how to isolate the specific context of the gut-brain axis. It doesn't. So it doesn't establish a human-centric contextual boundary. It will color outside the lines, ultimately with the purpose of generating new text or writing net new research based on an understanding of the past. However, when I tell it to isolate the context, the contextual language around the gut-brain axis, it can do amazing things. And here's a very real example. On the left of your screen, and by the way, if you can't read this, do not worry, I will illustrate a couple of points here. On the left, you've got an output from generative AI, okay? Where I ask it to help me understand how consumers think about the gut-brain axis today. Okay, so what does generative AI do? It tells me, oh, the consumers link it to probiotics. They think probiotics is beneficial. is about beneficial bacteria and some associated with improved cognition. They connect it to prebiotics, they connect it to omega-3 fatty acids, they connect it to fiber-rich foods in a Mediterranean diet. This is not coming from literal consumer conversations in the context of gut health. It's generating new research based on its large language model. It's doing a creative exercise here for me, right? Here's what happens on the right. When I give it the contextual language around the gut-brain axis coming from actual consumers in the last year, it tells me, hey, consumers are discussing the link between gastroenterological issues and brain health. They believe digestive problems like IBS, Crohn's, colitis can cause brain fog, anxiety, depression. That's number one. Number two, they're learning about the link between inflammatory diet and brain health. Number three, consumers are talking about gut health and how the production of calming neurotransmitters like serotonin and GABA can assist in improving and reducing anxiety and depression and mental health issues. Look at the difference here. We're getting real deep insight on the right side. From the same AI tool, it's just now what I've done is confined it to the contextual discourse coming from real human beings over the last year around the gut-brain axis. And I did a second thing, which I'll talk about a little further, is I gave it a methodology. I told it how to analyze language the same way an anthropologist would analyze it. So I'll come to that in a second. But that's the difference. It's a stark difference, and it's a powerful difference. Here's another example. I asked generative AI to come up with the major symbolism, the themes that symbolize beauty in America today. Okay, on the left is what generative AI came up with: aesthetic harmony, inner radiance, transcendence, timeless elegance. Okay, on the right is what generative AI came up with when we confined it to contextual language over the last year around the context of beauty from women. And suddenly you see resiliency, self-care, inclusion, power and prestige, femininity. Again, this is another illustration of how much more useful generative AI becomes in the context of research when we give it the contextual language map, when we use anthropology to its full potential in the context of AI. And let's dive into that. Here's an example of the interpretation that generative AI did. Specifically, I asked it to dig into the topic of resiliency, so the first topic on that list. And here's what it did. It said consumers are looking for beauty products that make them feel happy and confident even when they're facing adversity. For example, they might use bright and bold lipstick or colorful eyeshadow to lift their mood and make them feel more resilient. This is real insight. It's coming from an analysis of language in the context of beauty from women in the subcontext of resiliency, right? Where we're here, another example, looking for products that help cope with stress and anxiety, like aromatherapy and essential oils and so on and so on. Fundamental difference. Still the same AI tool. So this is how we're approaching this at Lux Motive Base as well, where GPT, as an example, becomes an interpretation layer rather than a data layer. It becomes an interpretation layer rather than a fundamental organization layer. So anthropology helps us determine the context, helps us get the contextual data, helps us organize the data, structure the data, and surface the data to GPT, to generative AI. Then anthropology tells generative AI, here's how I want you to analyze this pattern of language, which is, by the way, what you're seeing in the GIF on the right side of your screen is a live analysis on the topic of inflammatory diet in the context of gut health, where GPT is doing an interpretation by looking at the subcontext of inflammation, looking at the language and analyzing that language the same way a human anthropologist would, certainly trying to emulate the process. It does a pretty good job, and I would say gets a good 70% of the way there, which is immensely powerful for researchers, especially as we're doing early front-end exploration, especially when we want to be more agile in our processes. Again, I'm not saying this is the only way to do things, but this is certainly one method to bring human centricity forward, especially as AI takes over the research and innovation landscape and offers us some immense promises. So this is really what fundamentally I want to leave you with, and I want to come back to the ultimate problem we began this session with, right? Which is that, the purpose of AI is not to do research for you the way it stands today. It's to generate new data from an analysis of existing data. But when we tell it what to color within, when we give it the context to color within, when we tell it how to color, begin at the top, then do all the sides and the edges, then color in the middle. When we give it the methodology and we tell it what the context is, it can do immensely powerful things. So let's come back to the three fundamental tenets of human centricity, right? We talked about context, we talked about interpretation, but we didn't necessarily talk about reflexivity, and this is my chance to close the loop on that. Reflexivity is about taking out biases. AI and technology has incredible power in helping us do that. Why? Because in the traditional circumstance, for example, before Jason and I started MotiveBase, we were in-field ethnographers. We would go into fields, spend hours and hours, weeks and months following people around, spending time with them, trying to understand how they gave meaning to a particular context. It was impossible. As much as we tried, it was impossible to take our personal biases away. What technology does is it says, look, you can't talk to the consumer. You can't spend time with human beings. All you can do is follow the breadcrumbs of language and analyze those breadcrumbs. So it starts to, look, nothing is completely free of bias, but it starts to eliminate bias immensely. It is leaps and bounds ahead of traditional methodologies because we do not have the luxury of just picking up the phone and talking to somebody or going and seeing a consumer. We have to follow the breadcrumbs. We have to analyze the breadcrumbs using a scientific methodology, and a methodology that has 100-year rich heritage and history. And what AI does is now allows us to accelerate this and scale this even further. So when you put all three together, you realize, wow, the combination of anthropology and generative AI has some immense potential for the future of research, for the future of human innovation, and I think most importantly, for the future of bringing human centricity more cohesively throughout the enterprise. Thank you. We're open to questions.
Thanks so much, Ujwal. That was really, really great. I have some, as this has been playing out, we've got some really, really kind of interesting engagement. I'm going to go a little bit out of order. The first question I want to ask you, because I love it so much, is what role does empathy play in the AI anthropology approach, and how does it contribute to developing a more meaningful and human-centric AI solution?
Yeah, great question. We often associate empathy with seeing people face to face, spending time with people. But if you actually break down the process of achieving empathy, and by the way, I'm going to say something that is probably a bit controversial. It is very difficult to build empathy for another human being. It's just fundamental to our human reality. There are too many things that are required for us to truly, truly empathize. We have to be in a similar life circumstance, similar context. Very difficult. Here's what's a lot easier. It's a lot easier for us to build understanding. So if you imagine empathy as a scale, it's impossible to build 100% empathy, but you can probably get 70, 80% of the way there. And I think that's our goal as good human-centric researchers. But the first step in that process is building understanding. And how do you build understanding? Anthropology at scale allows us to build understanding because going back to that gut health example, and I'll jump to that slide here. Going back to that gut health example, it forces us to build an understanding of how people think about gut health because it's teaching us that it's not enough to know that gut is in connection to immunity. We also need to know it's about chronic health, it's about toxins, it's about wellness. It doesn't matter whether it's scientifically correct or not. What matters is it matters to human beings. Right there is step one of building understanding. This is what's so powerful about this that sometimes we don't realize. Actually, following the breadcrumbs is a much better way for us to build understanding. It detaches us from people, detaches us from our own personal experience in a way. And when you add AI to the mix, it scales that entire process. So it allows us in many ways to build empathy at scale and to build empathy in a much faster and more timely manner.
I think that the one build I would love to add to that is that no matter how hard we try when we work in innovation and insight, and we're driven by kind of the objectives and goals that are faced day in and day out in helping an organization thrive, it's almost impossible not to basically apply an industry lens to kind of how you're approaching a problem and how you're approaching something. Because at the end of the day, that's the majority of the conversation. That's what you're faced with day to day. How are we going to achieve these goals that are going to help the organization thrive? And I think what's really interesting about what Ujwal's talking about is that this forces us to kind of remove that industry lens and to truly look at things from a consumer standpoint, from a human standpoint, in order to open ourselves up to things that are important to people, that shed light on where there may be a potential opportunity or a barrier or a risk that would have gone unnoticed if it was not to basically open ourselves up to really look at that hop, skip, and a jump away of something that is growing in importance amongst large groups of people. So I think that in and of itself helps us become more empathetic. So that's perfect. Thank you very much, Ujwal. One of the questions we have here is about how incorporating cultural anthropology into AI algorithms and systems can really benefit a business in terms of customer engagement and loyalty. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what you've seen in the industry in regards to kind of where this can go, the types of places it can start to really kind of help teams thrive in that particular instance?
Yeah, I would say the two most important areas is value and convenience, because these are two areas that are, sort of beaten to death in our industry. And I think the biggest mistake we all make is, obviously it impacts loyalty, but the biggest mistake we make is we think value is a rational idea. We think convenience is a rational idea. We think value means getting something at the cheapest price. We think convenience means getting something as easily as possible. What this human-centric approach allows us to understand is, within a context, the definition of value changes. So I'll give you a great example. A retailer that promises value around sustainable alternatives may require you to go into store, may require you to go explore products. But what they do really well, let's say, is make it easy for you to find and access sustainable alternatives at a reasonable price. They make it easy for you to make decisions around sustainable alternatives without needing to severely educate yourself. For a consumer who cares about making small strides in their lives around sustainability, that's of immense value. So even though to a certain extent it's an inconvenience, even though to a certain extent they're paying a higher price, the consumer considers that of value. Why? Because it's important for their social status, for their identity, their sense of self, that they make small strides. And here's a retailer that understands that about me. The first question was about empathy. Talk about empathy here. This is what the power of human centricity is, right? Is understanding what is the human condition? What does the human being innately want us to do for them? What is the problem they want us to solve? And then you put value and convenience in that context. The same applies for loyalty, right? These are all factors that impact loyalty, but I think we need to ask, fundamentally, what does the consumer want? What purpose does the human being want us as an organization to solve for them in their lives? Solve that problem. Begin with that problem. Begin with a problem orientation rather than a solution orientation. This is what I will leave you with, because I think these are all really important conversations, and especially in corporate research, I think we've done them wrong for decades, and this is an amazing opportunity for us to revisit some of these things that we often dismiss or think are quite simple to do, but actually they're complex, and we need to be understanding and taking all the complexity in if we want to do a good job.
That's great. I think that as you're talking, Ujwal, it just makes me think of the notion of relevancy, right? And it makes me think of the simple, tangible, actionable idea of thinking about like that point of purchase and the main benefit that is presented to somebody in like the CPG category. And it's like, if that benefit is irrelevant to the consumer that is most important to your business, then you have lost the battle. And again, like, this is really about understanding kind of the large cultural forces that are moving, that are shaping the decisions and choices that consumers are making, all the way down to making sure that at that moment of truth, you truly understand who the consumer is, what is important to them, and that you're prioritizing the thing that is important to them in order to stand out in a sea of parity and chaos, to be quite honest. So I think that, you know, that notion of value, convenience, and then that understanding of how are you basically kind of making that connection with the consumer in the most profound way possible. That's great. That's really, really great. I think that we'll kind of call things there. As I mentioned, if there were two other questions, and I believe that we'll be able to kind of reach out to those people individually, but this is going to conclude our webinar for today. Just so you know, the slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to everybody via email a little bit later. After leaving the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation, and we'd really appreciate any feedback you may have to help inform us for any of our future webinars. So please also take a moment to see some of the other webinars that will be coming down the pipe. We really hope to see you all again very, very soon. But with that, I just want to say thank you very much, Ujwal, for the presentation.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody for joining us. And I hope everyone has a really, really great day.